try. And if you could just let me know if you see that.
We do.
Okay, perfect. Great. Well, thank you, Tim. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate the kind words. I look forward to future sessions where I can meet all of you in person. We can have this conversation. Yeah, I've been with Aviat now 19 years, and this is going back to when we were still Harris MCD. And I actually used to support the Southern California region, so I know a lot of the agencies, although the names I don't really remember. But so this is kind of a coming home in a sense for me. So recently, a big focus of ours, and I think as for others, has been all the stimulus money that's been available in the US. And it seems like there's still a lot of funding that's upcoming. So the biggest challenge that we've addressed or found in talking to customers has been the accessibility and how agencies can actually utilize the funding. So what I've been doing and what we've been doing at Aviat has been collecting kind of like, call it best practices, case studies of how others have utilized the money. So what I have today is a fairly short presentation that provides a quick update on what is happening specifically with the ARPA funding. And then a case study of a project we did last year, it's been about a year and a half now, that utilized stimulus funding. And it was the first known project that we're aware of where a large public safety agency used stimulus funds for a large network upgrade. So I'll go through that. And then just to kind of share some of the best practices we've learned. And this is not meant to be like a simplex conversation. I would love any opinions and feedback that anybody in the audience has, because we're kind of evolving the message based on what we learn. And every scenario, every case is going to be different. So hopefully this helps provide some background. And then we welcome the opportunity to get involved with other conversations, other learnings, so that we can upgrade and update the messaging that we have. So that's kind of to set the table. ARPA, so what we'll be talking about is ARPA. And what we've done at Aviat is we've set up a dedicated website where we collect information, share it with the public. And I have the web link I'll share at the end. I'll also make this presentation available and some of the resources. But we've completed a couple of webinars on the topic. And the first one was just purely informational that talks about what it is, what it means, the timeline, etc. Session 2 is what I'll be sharing today. So it's a modified version of the session 2 where we went through this public safety case study. And then we're going to have a third one that we want to do once we've collected more information, feedback and input. So this is kind of like a summary of what we've done so far and what we're planning to do. And I mean, ARPA, if anybody's not familiar with it, it's the American Rescue Plan Act. It was passed about a year and a half ago or so. So it's been in circulation. And it was meant to provide a vehicle for public safety agencies at every level, city, county, state, Native American and tribal agencies as well, to be able to recover from either the pandemic or to be ready for the next big emergency. And that's kind of the summary. The whole bill is about it's about $1.9 trillion, and it covers everything that you can anticipate. Now, of that entire funding, 350 billion has been allocated for state, local governments, tribal governments for emergency response preparedness. Now, when the bill was first passed, when ARPA was first passed, it was I'll call it an update to the previously passed CARES Act. CARES was passed immediately after COVID-19 had forced all the shutdowns, shelter in place, and CARES had a lifeline or timeline of 1 year. So any agency that needed to use that funding had a year to file for it, get approval, and then start utilizing the funding. ARPA adds on to it. Now, since CARES was first released, ARPA has gone in and added a little bit more detail and clarity around what the funding can be used for. CARES was very generic. You could use it for whatever needs and resources you need. ARPA was a little bit more detailed and allowed some provisions on where to use it. Now, just recently, and I apologize, the date should have been updated, but in October of 2021, so just 4 or 5 months ago, the Senate passed a bill to update some of the proceedings or some of the details in the ARPA bill. So they added a little bit more detail and actually elements that help increase the usage of ARPA for public safety agencies. So one of the key things that they've added was a process that public safety agencies can use ARPA to modernize their network infrastructure. So they call out cybersecurity, hardware, software protection of critical infrastructure. We know that this includes, from experience with CARES, the infrastructure that applies to any of the mission critical network that agencies have, microwave, two-way radio systems, everything associated with it. Now, this provision enables the usage of ARPA for these projects now even more explicitly. And I'll go through kind of the progression of that. So this is a great update, because previously what we found from conversations was that ARPA is allocated, and I'll show you the allocations, but how agencies can access that funding was a little bit ambiguous, and there was a lot of gray area and so on. So this ruling in this language actually increases the likelihood of being able to use that. And the bill actually points out that for the county level, if you're a county agency, you can use up to $10 million of any ARPA money that you have specifically for this element, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure. And it's kind of like fast-tracked through the process. So this is, again, great update. I think it's going to help all of our agencies that we interact with be able to access that funding more easily than previously. And then, of course, this is still evolving. There's still so much funding coming out. The infrastructure plan that focuses on infrastructure that includes the grid, the mission critical grid and infrastructure related to it. All of these will have similar language. And so this is an important step because it will lead into future stimulus plans. So this is a high level allocation. Of the 350 billion, 195 billion is allocated at the state level. So here's where ARPA becomes unique. In the past, when we had the UASI grants, all the Homeland Security funding, there was an allocation that was made for every agency, but you had to apply. So if the state of California needed it or the city of Los Angeles needed funding, they would individually apply and then they would get the allocation. With ARPA, what the federal government has done is they've allocated at the state level, they've allocated at the county level, and they've allocated at the city level. So the city of LA has their own funding. They also have accessibility and the ability to use the county of LA's funding because they're in that same county. And then lastly, they have the ability to get funding from the state of California as well, in case they need to go up these tiers. And the way the allocation was done is based on the population. So any entity, any agency, city, county, town, with a population greater than 500,000 gets funding. Now, the larger the population, the bigger the distribution of funding. And so that's how it was initially allocated. If we look at the counties and cities, here's the total of how it was allocated. So there's obviously a lot of money available and at all the different agency levels. And it's managed directly with the Treasury Department. So the funding is allocated. There is a process, and I believe I have some slides on that, but there is a registration process. So if you're with the city, if you're the appropriate person to bind the city in a contract with the federal government or manages grant funding or anything financial related to spending, you register with the Treasury Department, you become the point of contact, and then the Treasury will basically then work with you on disbursement of the funds, reporting, and so on. So that's how simple the process is. Now, again, the biggest challenge that we came across was how does the funding get accessed? What's the process and so on? And it's a little different depending on agency. So we're still kind of consolidating some of that information. So ARPA, before this ruling that I mentioned that was passed in October, it was very clear. And so we've referenced the section in the actual legislation that talks about how the funds can be used. And ARPA is meant to not only increase the spending on broadband, so to help populations that are unserved and underserved, but then also broadband applications for public safety and so on. It's also meant to improve capital investments and then also rebuilding any parts of the network to improve the infrastructure, improve technology, and get networks ready for next generation applications. So there's a couple of areas where ARPA did specify the funding usage, and this is how it was set up. In terms of public safety, common things: reliability, capacity, scalability. So a couple of things here is that a lot of the public safety networks across the country are either well past the kind of the period of obsolescence, meaning the equipment is either entirely end of life or key components of the network are end of life, or maybe a year or 2 years away from it and need a refresh. Or there are some capacity issues where they're either not prepared for increasing services, applications, or the reliability is going through some challenges that really puts the network at risk. And then scalability in the sense that as these networks are modernizing and looking forward to next generation applications, they're just not ready and equipped to be able to handle either the coverage, the capacity, the reliability, or all of these combined. So these were the three key elements that we identified, and this is from conversations, from projects, and then even just looking at current upgrade profiles that customers have. And identifying that these are the reasons why using ARPA to modernize the network so that it could improve the quality of service to the constituents of the agency, whether it's the population, to the police responders, emergency responders, it needs to be utilized for that. And I think the language has now done a much better job of actually improving and aligning those things together. So we're looking at the applications piece separately. This graph kind of talks about or kind of shows the interest that the public safety community has in next generation applications. So this is a survey that was done by one of the branches of the federal government. And it was a survey that was done of, I forget how many hundreds of public safety officials, leadership, and actual agency users from EMS, the fire fighting groups, law enforcement groups. And this is kind of the feedback. So a lot of these applications are either already in use and being deployed today or being planned over the next 5+ years. So the bottom line here is that new applications, new services, and then also new technology is forthcoming. And the networks that we know today, we talked about it a little earlier, it's changing and there's a lot of evolution. So there's going to be even more pressure and constraints on the network than we have today. So the case study, I think, does a good job of kind of consolidating all of these things. We were working with a public safety agency, and this is a fairly large agency. I can't go into too much details because the project is still underway, and there's an agency legal limitation that we cannot reference the project and so on, at least in a public forum. But if there's any questions individually, I can absolutely share. We can provide references and so on. But it's a fairly large agency, over 100 sites, population well over 1.5 million. And the network is very old. And over time, they've gone through some replacements, some updates and upgrades, but it's been very, very small. Funding was the big reason. Now, funding was the limiter from the beginning, and why this agency just could not do a full upgrade. So parts of the network had been slightly updated, replacing and upgrading power systems, adding some infrastructure support. But overall, the entire network was still pretty old. 15 years old. A lot of these devices were already end of life, maintenance support, and kind of eating into the maintenance contract. At the same time, capacity was becoming a bottleneck. So many of the sites, the core sites were all OC3 Sonnet, but as they moved further away, it was only a DS3. And all the new services that were riding on this network were forcing the capacity to go up. And because of the terrain, because of the regions, there was no fiber in the footprint. So that was not an option. So we started working with this group many years ago, I would say at least 7 to 8, and identifying a plan to do upgrades. And what we were able to come up with was kind of a phased approach that provided some upgrades at the core system where there was a immediate need for upgrade, and then kind of expand out from there. And then we also kind of put together a plan to say, let's target a certain capacity. And in this case, it was about 450 megabits to be able to support upcoming video, new applications, and then also retain their existing services. And then upgrade that later on as like a phase 2 or phase 3 approach once more funding was available, and then there was a little bit more ease to it. And it was trying to reuse as much of the existing sites as possible. So tower access, changing antennas, having to upgrade any towers was definitely a big concern. So again, the challenge here, the main thing was cost, funding, and then it was timing, and then it was technology. So there were a couple of things that this customer was looking at. And these were the key concerns that were apparent. So on the technology side, what we were looking at was upgrading the network so that they could get not only enough capacity for like the next 2 to 3 years, but then also have this network ready for the future. So this fairly simple, I would say straightforward explanation that as you start increasing capacity, which you see designated as with this red line, you can see that as capacity increases, as you increase modulation, you have a system gain decrease. This is well known. Every time you increase modulation, you increase the capacity profile by about 10%. But once you cross 128 QAM, the capacity increase actually slopes downward, which is why you kind of see a more steep slope, and then it starts to flatten off. And in the past, higher modulations were just not that attractive or deployed because your system gain drop off was just too significant. And for a public safety network, it was just not acceptable to have that trade-off. Now, throughput becomes a big consideration, but reliability is even bigger. So you cannot sacrifice reliability for capacity. So oftentimes what happens is you see networks that are multi-channel, combination of high modulation, multi-channel, there's some fiber in the network and so on. But knowing this customer and how they were limited, no fiber, we still have to maintain the reliability. There were a couple of things we were looking at. So what we ended up doing was providing a design and shooting for a target of 1 gigabit over the air. So in this case, what we did with the existing network was take the existing frequency pairs and channels they had, and then upgrading any of those that had like a 10 meg channel or a lower modulation, and maximizing those up as much as we could. And then what we did was we looked at adding additional channels to every site. So now every site and every link either had multiple 6 gig channels, in this case up to 4 channels, or multiple 11 gig channels. At 11 gig, we were using as much as 3 channels in parallel. So with each of these links using 30 meg, 40 meg channels, all the way up to 4096 QAM, we were able to hit over a gig of traffic across the entire network. And we were still able to use, maintain a 5 nines and a 5 reliability objective for the critical traffic. And I'll show you what I mean by that. We had path lengths that ranged anywhere from 1 to 33 miles. So we had a separation of frequency bands. And then we used extra high power radios wherever we needed to, just to make sure that we had the reliability objectives. And one of the key limitations here was that we could not change the antenna sizes. So everywhere possible, we designed the system so that we could reuse the existing antenna system. So just simply, here's what it looked like. We had the radio units carrying multiple channels, all connected to a single antenna. If it was diversity, there was a diversity connection as well. And then we aggregated it together with the indoor box, our Eclipse unit, and then handed that off to a router system that the agency was using. So the connections at this level to the router were all done using L1LA. and it was connected directly into the routing system. Now, what this does is it makes all of these channels, and in this case, consider 4 unique RF channels carrying traffic, but this connection to the router is a seamless pipe that looks like one connection to the router. So all the traffic that you're carrying is aggregated together, and it's a hitless and seamless aggregation of traffic between all the different channels. So it makes it look like one big data pipe. And when we started talking about, well, how much high priority traffic is needed, out of the 1 gig, what we identified with the customer was that at least 700 megabits should be allocated for high priority traffic. So this is real-time voice, data, some of the services, and so on. The rest of the traffic, 80 megabits and then 268, were low, medium priority, best effort. So this is LAN traffic, internet traffic, maybe some remote workforce traffic, and so on. So using this approach, what we did was we designed this high priority bandwidth using 256 QAM across 4 channels, and we were able to hit the 5 nines 5 reliability. Then the next 80 megabits were designed with the 4 nines and a 5, 4 nines and an 8 in this case. And then the remaining Ethernet traffic was all at a 2 nines best effort. So this is sufficient. The low priority traffic, and this was actually a good example of how traffic separation can and should be used based on the priority of the traffic. All the high priority traffic was seamless to what the network had today. So if it was voice, if it was data, all the latencies, all the reliabilities, all of that was matched up identically. In some cases, even better, because we were increasing the power. All the low priority traffic, this is like data and some video surveillance that does not have to be real time. That was okay with a lower reliability, the 2 nines, and so on. So it was a great idea to be able to do that. Here's a listing of the traffic and how we separated it. So in this case, the customer went from best case 155 megabits all the way up to 720 megabits with the same antennas, and the rest of it was available for other applications and services. So this was the design we presented to them. Simple. I won't go through this in detail, but how we migrated the existing network. They were running OC3 DS1s in some cases. We applied a hybrid radio so that they can carry all their existing traffic seamlessly and then upgrade Ethernet connected to a router. So that was maintained. So this now gave them a full design. They don't have to worry about the antennas. They have a plan to go through and get additional capacity. And now the funding became the key thing. Let me quickly go through this because I know we're kind of short on time. So what we did then was we presented this agency with a couple of different pricing options. And at the same time, we started talking to them about funding. CARES had just been launched. And so one of the things that this agency did was they reached out to their legislation and asked about any stimulus funding. And CARES came up. Now, at the same time, the FCC and this department called CISA had also reached out to all governors across the country, and they provided a letter to the governors saying to make sure that they're looking at their public safety requirements, any needs, if there's anything that needs to happen to upgrade, modernize the network to make sure that the state agencies and the public safety system can respond to COVID and other emergencies, we recommend you move forward with that. And so this agency was able to use this letter as well as talk to the legislator about getting stimulus to replace this old network. And they were able to use CARES funding for this entire project. So what had started off as a multi-phase upgrade project, and I think we were allocating maybe $1 million or $2 million for the first couple of phases, turned into an $18 million project where we were able to upgrade the entire network. And so that agency was able to incorporate everything that they needed to, the full capacity profile, replacing all the end-of-life equipment, putting in new service contracts, and so on. And they were able to do that using the CARES funding. They provided a letter. That letter was passed on to the federal government. It was signed off, and so on. So this gives us and all of our customers now a couple of case studies and data points to reference. this letter, it's a generally available letter that's made out to every governor. That plus the case study that we used with this CARES Act are templates that we give to our customers who are looking to use ARPA now for their network needs. So we have a template letter that we drafted with this agency that talks about why mission critical public safety networks fall under the realm of stimulus funding, what it means to the constituents, emergency response, and so on. So we'll share that. I think it's a great resource and reference. That was how we were able to use this funding for this project. So just a summary of a couple of things. Anytime you have a situation as unprecedented as COVID, it exposes a lot of vulnerabilities in our networks that we otherwise take for granted. So any end of life, any obsolescence, any network that isn't ideally designed and implemented is a vulnerability. So this is an opportunity that we see customers to be able to utilize this funding and start the process. And at the same time, like this agency did that I showed you, it's an opportunity to see if we can try to meet all the goals that we have, rather than here's the bare minimum that I can get use or do, and then we'll worry about the rest later. And then it represents a great case study for ARPA, because this is intended to meet the requirements of support and security for the constituents of the agency. So that is it. Again, our website has a lot of different resources and tools that you can utilize. This is just a quick sample of them. I will again send this out so you have access to it, and then some of the templates that I mentioned. And more importantly, I would love and welcome some conversation and see if we can get some more insight from all of you, or of any of you that have had some trouble in the past trying to get some of this funding, because again, it will be unique. So I hope this helps. I think that was the last slide. If there's any questions, I could answer them now, and then again, I'll provide these details.